and welcome to this home edition of Politics Today. And in this programme, we'll be asking, are we dangerously heading towards an authoritarian state with the government's Coronavirus Act extended by another 6 months? And in this programme today, I'm joined by Dave Barlace, who is the Director for Intercessors for Britain, and of course, Melanie Simmons, the Director of Heart newspaper. So welcome to the programme. Firstly, I'll start off with you, Dave. Warm welcome to Politics Today. And it's great to see fresh faces on this programme. Can you share with us a little bit about your background? And I know that we've recently met up through Halford House. And so it's great that you can join us.
Yep, thanks very much, Simon. So yeah, I've been a believer. I grew up in a Christian home and been involved in church from early on, and then got involved with an organisation called Intercessors for Britain, mainly attending conferences, and then started to speak at them and lead days of prayer. Was invited to become the director of Intercessors for Britain just over coming up for 6 years ago. And I've been doing that for 6 years, been involved in looking at, we pray about abortion, about the nation, about what's going on in politics, what's going on in the church, and various aspects of that. We're certainly praying about the situation with the European Union as we came out as well. And so I've been doing that for the last 6 years, and just recently the Lord's called me to back to local ministry in the local fellowship, and that's how I've ended up in Halford House, serving as an elder here. And yeah, we'll looking forward to seeing what the Lord will do here.
Excellent. And Melanie, there is a new edition of Heart newspaper out. So as always, just give us a brief rundown on some of the big stories that you've covered for this April-May edition.
Thank you very much, Simon. Well, the headline the Lord's given me this time is "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free." And it is intended as an outreach paper. And we've been sending out extra copies to churches today. There's a church in Merseyside is having a couple of hundred, one in Swanley a couple of hundred, and so on, and to individuals so they can put it through doors. We've got a story on page 2 by our own Robin Benson on well, he called it Passover Puzzles, but it's really more about the last week of Jesus's life. And page 3, we've got, this is more for churches, but a couple of stories of people who've set up their own meetings. And then we get on to the more controversial stuff, because there's been a couple of people recently said to me, well, I came to the Lord because I actually looked at the end times, what was going on, and they didn't use the term end time, but they realized that God had to be in charge, or we were in a right mess. So we've got this wonderful piece here on Bible prophecy that's by Keith Malcolmson, who's the fiery Northern Irish pastor who last October he started talking on the Great Reset, making videos, and the Lord said to him, if you leave it for another week it'll be too late. And so he preached recently at a very good conference called Navigating the Pandemic Fog, and that's his talk from that. I've also got a talk which Philip Wren gave to another group. Is there really an elite who have significant control over global affairs? And this was very interesting. This gave me stuff which I hadn't, there we go, yes, background which I hadn't known. And it was extraordinary, really. And he traced it through history. And people, we've got quotes from Dennis Healy and Henry Kissinger. They're
Excellent.
all sort of Bilderbergs, etc.
But Melanie, you do want people to read the newspapers, so just to encourage our viewers that the new edition of Heart newspaper is out, and
Yes.
It's a very good newspaper and a very good read. So we need to support Melanie in these endeavours in this time where our press freedoms are being curtailed. It's important that we support Christians, particularly those in the media. Dave, as the UK Director for Intercessors for Britain and praying over the nation, what would you say is currently the spiritual state of the nation in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, even though the government is now releasing those very draconian measures, and within a couple of weeks we can get a haircut. Well, I certainly can, and Melanie can as well. And we can go and actually shop, and life can get back to a little bit of normality.
Yeah. So I think the question that's been considered and being considered is, has anything changed? Has anything changed spiritually? Have we heeded? Have we learned the lesson? Do we even consider that God had anything to do with this? I remember when 9/11 happened and David Wilkerson was speaking about it, and they had prayed before. They sensed something was coming, and they'd cancelled all their meetings and they'd met to pray, and they knew that the Lord was something was going to happen. And yet people came to him afterwards and they said the Lord had nothing to do with 9/11. And again, similarly, we see in the church that people can't consider that the Lord has even allowed this thing, let alone sent it as a judgment upon us. And so the question, I think, and the state of the nation really surrounds, do we understand what's taken place? Have we understood it from a spiritual perspective? We've seen the laws, we've seen the contentions around all these issues about lockdown and all these other things. But what was the Lord saying, and what was the Lord doing through this pandemic? And I think we're really at a state where there's going to be that place where either the church understood what has taken place, or they are just blind to it and not hear it, and not moved by it. And that's a dangerous place to be if Lord sent such a judgment as this upon us, and all we can do is pray, that the NHS would cope better, and we'd eventually we'll be allowed out, and all these other things. Then I think we've missed the point, and that's a concerning thing, I think, for us as a nation.
Absolutely. And Melanie, you've been keeping very close tabs on what's going on. We know that back in March of 2020, the government introduced this Coronavirus Act 2020, which has given the British government unprecedented power, the most power by any executive in peacetime, with a real power to curtail our freedoms. And only last week, as of this recording, the government voted to extend this legislation by a further 6 months, in which 484 MPs voted for it, 76 against. But surprisingly, there were 35 Conservative MPs who voted against this legislation. What are your concerns regarding the Coronavirus Act and the implications for personal freedom and liberty?
Well, there are huge implications, and I was extremely concerned when I heard about last Thursday's vote, as per the day we're recording, and I understood that it was 46 who'd voted against, but if it's 76, that's good. But there was a mixture of Tories, a few Labour, and the Lib Dems. And when I heard this vote and this majority, huge majority, I thought, have they debated this? Have they considered the implications? And I actually want to write to my MP and say, because I do pest him a fair amount, and he sends back the standard government line. And I want to say to him, could you tell me what percentage of your constituents were you representing in that vote? Who, constituents who contacted you and said, yes, we were happy for this to continue. Because this town where I am is full of small businesses. It's full of people who are, they are mainly Conservative voters. They would have normally voted for the party of private enterprise. And when I heard of this vote, I thought to myself, this is just like the Russian Duma. All they have done is rubber stamped the leader's decision. It's quite extraordinary. And yet I tell myself it could be worse. If it was Labour in, it would be more draconian because of Sir Keir Starmer's track record. And a friend of mine was saying that perhaps the only way that Conservatives will listen is if we vote for another party in the local elections. That's all, vote for the party which looks like the Lib Dems, who have actually rebelled over this.
Absolutely. And Dave, if we kind of unpack this Coronavirus Act 2020, what it says is that this gives the government emergency powers. in response to the pandemic. It means that the government can close borders. It means it can postpone elections, suspend the power to recall any MP committing a crime, detaining anyone who might be infectious, and relaxing human rights safeguards. We also see an increase in surveillance and retention of DNA, the closing off of care homes, and new draconian measures to actually erode civil liberties. And like I said before, this is the biggest expansion of the government's executive powers ever before in peacetime. And we know that once governments have these powers, then there is a reluctance to give them back. What are your concerns with this Coronavirus Act? And are you personally concerned about what this means in terms of civil liberties, but also what it means for Christian freedoms in this country?
Yeah, so there were a few things in this latest round. They did drop some of the powers, and certainly some very concerning powers that they did previously have. 16 powers, I think, were given back to us. Our freedoms were given back in 16 particular areas, which was very generous of them. In that, he says sarcastically. There are many places where it's gone way beyond what was required. I mean, let's take churches, for example. Many churches have chose to close their doors before the government required them to do it. They have closed their doors during the high peak of this most recent wave. They act responsibly. They have a duty of care to people. They don't need government to tell them what to do to look after people. And there's civil acts that they could be taken to court civilly for, not protecting the public. There are very many legislations previously, also lots of health and safety laws that are already in place that could have protected and looked after people. But this really large overarching bill, particularly as you've described it, is just a situation where they've gone, well, let's take as much power as we can just in case we need it. And again, this extension to September, why have we extended it to September? If the government roadmap is followed, then we should be rid of all restrictions in June. So why didn't they limit it? And such are the powers in this act. It should be really limited time-wise. It should be, as Graham Brady said in one of the debates, no one, when they first brought this in March 2020, envisaged it would still be here. At this point, it was an emergency law. And to continue to hold these things, that's the concern. But yeah, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're coming to the end of it, hopefully. You can have some justification in taking some of these measures. But when does it stop? How does it end? How do we take those powers back? Because there's this indication in the bill that, well, they can just keep them on hold and just press play whenever they want to reintroduce them. And again, these are extraordinary powers. So yeah, there's a very real concern about these things. We don't know what will happen in the next 5 years. We don't know what will happen at the next election, who might be standing. At the moment, this is Boris Johnson, someone who's been apparently a proclaimer of civil liberties, who's gone this far. What happens if it's someone not like that? That's a terrifying prospect, and we're seeing it in other parts of the world.
Absolutely. And Melanie, the government justifies the Coronavirus Act 2020 on the grounds that it measures it as reasonable, proportionate, and based upon the latest scientific evidence. Now, if we take today as the recording of this program, the number of deaths related to COVID is now 8. Which is the lowest since early September of 2020. Considering our population is 60 million, and of course, 8 deaths due to COVID-19 is 8 deaths too many. But considering this, and the population is 60 million, surely there is no need for the government to actually extend this emergency powers for another 6 months.
Yes, that's why I found the vote in Parliament quite extraordinary. And I think people should be writing to their MPs and asking them why they voted that way, because we've never had, even in communist countries, a government telling you can't hug your granny, or creating this climate which we now have. We now have thousands, if not millions, of people who probably don't say boo to a goose, and others who are feeling quietly stroppy or whatever. It is a huge concern, and it was brought home to me when we were contacted by a lady who grew up in Belarus, and she said, I want to write an article for your paper because I grew up in a communist dictatorship and I think it's coming here. And one more show of the paper, it is here, this letter, and she wants to do a follow-up article. And she's a lovely lady, and she says that when our whole life in the USSR was under state control, in maternity hospitals, babies were separated from mother straight away, were vaccinated. We were told for whooping cough, polio, tetanus, measles, smallpox, without even letting mothers know, asking their permission. It was mandatory. Children would not be accepted into nursery and school without proof of vaccination. Adults were obliged to have medical examinations and certain vaccines to hold on to their jobs. This is what we keep being threatened with here. And there's a review underway about COVID status certificates. The vaccine passport has morphed into the COVID status certificate, which the Cabinet Office under Michael Gove is reviewing, and we'll get in mid-April a report back. We've all responded. Whether it makes any difference, I don't know. And she says, in the UK, those who refuse the vaccine, including myself, are already labelled as selfish, not caring for others. It's shocking to hear government propaganda here in capitalist Britain that's so similar to the USSR's propaganda. And she's talked again about how you have to have your passport all the time, show your passport for anything. So it is extremely concerning. And I just want to make the point about the 8 deaths. These are people who have tested positive for coronavirus within the last 28 days. It doesn't include the deaths in care homes after people have had the vaccine. And there's a question asked in Parliament last week about that. And Matt Hancock was asked by 2 MPs, William Ragg and Sir Christopher Chope, what statistics were being kept for that, because there is quite a lot of anecdotal evidence coming out. But of course, if people die after they've had the vaccine, that's comorbidities. So there are things in an inquiry that needs to come out as well. So it does seem way over the top, and I don't know what the justification is.
And Dave, looking at this whole COVID-19, the government's response, the lockdowns we've all faced, the massive erosion of civil liberties, the closure of churches, our lack of mobility, in other words, that we can't visit family and friends. We've got to stay in our homes, only going out for necessities. Now, it's one thing, the government doing everything it can to protect its citizens from a deadly virus, but the way the government's handled this, it's almost like a spirit of fear is over the nation when it comes to this. And we know where fear comes from. It doesn't come from the Lord, it comes from the enemy. So from your perspective, the way that the government is controlling the population and using fear as a tactics, isn't this very concerning? Because we see that authoritarian regimes, classic mode of operandi is actually using fear.
Yeah, it's a massively difficult part. Personally, I think we've gone through a very serious pandemic. Lots of people have died. Excess deaths bear out huge numbers of deaths. Around 15 to 20% more people have died in this 12-month period than previously. Now, that's something to be concerned about. Fear, obviously, is a whole other thing. There's a concern about that, and who's to say without these lockdown measures how many more people have died, and we'll never know. So there's an element in which promoting information about a virus is important and necessary, but then of course again it's something that controls and drives, and there's an element in which we teach people fear. Don't go near that cliff edge, don't go in the water, you don't know how to swim yet. There's an element in which fear protects, and so you can make an argument for using information to help people to make right choices. But as you've described, you know, this goes way beyond this helping people to make right choices. And again, information, you know, I believe that everyone should have the right to get as much information as possible and make an informed decision. I don't have a problem with government having a position on it. I don't have a problem with government informing, but it's when they compel, you know, things like compulsory vaccinations, which hopefully will never come, and I'll never support, even though I believe I've received the vaccine already, actually. And you know, I've not got a problem with anyone taking that. But I also respect everyone should be able to make that choice. And no one should feel terrified into making it. No one should feel like they're going to lose their job. You know, those are concerning steps far beyond what was previously okay in this country. And something that's concerned me all the way along is the way the government have handled this pushing of fear. The suggestion of a vaccine passport, the suggestion of compulsory vaccinations. Matt Hancock not ruled it out. Matt Hancock's gone further than I would ever expect of a Conservative health minister. And that's concerning. And it really doesn't help when you've got people who maybe, in my view, have quite very alarmist ideas about how, you know, government control and all these other things. It only gives more fuel to their fire. If the government were reasonable and were measured in their actions and the words, then they wouldn't have so many reasons to complain, and they do have reasons to complain. Those complaints are justified. So yeah, I think the project fear needs to stop. It continues on our news every night, and it's a question of, well, you've asked us to do this. We've got vaccinated. We've got high vaccine levels. What is it next that you're going to be demanding of us? Because those of us who have received these things, those of us who have put our lives on hold, you know, you can only take them so far. You can only expect cooperation so far. And I really think we've reached a point where they are testing the patience of the population.
Absolutely. Mandy, one thing I find very alarming about the Coronavirus Act, and particularly the role of the opposition and particularly our media as well, is there's been very, very little scrutiny on this legislation, and the fact that the government has given itself emergency and unprecedented powers, more so than any other government in peacetime, which affects our civil liberties. We could be arrested. I'm not saying the government would do this, but we potentially could be arrested without any pretext whatsoever and held for 14 days under this legislation on the pretext that we might have the virus and spread it to someone else. Now, this goes pretty much against the rule of law. There hasn't really been a thorough debate in Parliament. Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition and the Labour Party, has pretty much kept quiet and covertly supported the government on this. And our mainstream media as well, our main kind of TV news outlets haven't scrutinised the government on this at all. So, you know, are we starting to see our democratic freedoms, our civil liberties, our right to attend church and these centuries of wonderful democratic values that have been handed down from one generation to another look like they're under threat during these times?
Yes, I think it's more than under threat. I don't think we'll ever go back to how things were. Philip Wren, writing the latest edition of Heart, thinks that, you know, we've given up freedoms. People do when they feel threatened, and it's, as we've seen from this vote last week, it's very hard for a government to relinquish that amount of power and give it back to the people. You almost need a revolution to do it. And as you say, with an opposition like this, we're not going to have any massive turn of the tables if there's an election tomorrow. So many of us are choosing to keep away from mainstream media. I mean, I listen to the radio with a big pinch of salt, because the agenda is just becoming so clear now. I mean, I saw the BBC's agenda years ago when they reported on Israel, and now, so that sowed mistrust, and it's the same now. It's so carefully edited to kind of groom us into a certain way of thinking all the time, and to be grateful that we're allowed to go and see Granny or sit in her garden or whatever. It's quite extraordinary. And there's been an infantilizing of the population as well. I've been amazed at how many people actually believe it all and say, oh, good, I can do this, or I can do that, or whatever. And as Ray says, you know, people have given this all up. And now, even if they've been vaccinated, they're being told that's not enough, or there'll be more and more coming along. There is an opposition out there, and it's all online. And they are being actively censored, and that is another huge concern. In fact, in the event, what should we call it, the dry run, the planning apparently of all this, which is called Event 501 in 2019, held at Johns Hopkins University, sponsored by the Gates Foundation. One of the topics was how to deal with disinformation. And so that's why there's all these rapid rebuttals and so-called fact checkers. It's worth looking at who's funding the fact checkers. Sometimes Google is a big funder. So you have even a pro-life organization like LifeSite, who had a wonderful conference recently, Unmasking COVID-19, lots of doctors speaking. There's nothing in it for them. And talking about the potential danger of the vaccine, wearing masks, all factual stuff. And they've talked about all this. But of course, that whole site, LifeSite, which has a Catholic foundation, but bless them, they've already been good on pro-life. They've now been kicked off the main social media platforms. So has Robert F. Kennedy, who has been campaigning for children's health for years and the dangers of vaccines. Now, I'm not saying all vaccines are bad at all. Obviously, they're, you know, but they are trying to point people to danger so that they can have an informed opinion.
I'm just going to move on because we're coming to the end of the program. And Dave, within 30 seconds, with your position of being an intercessor, and we have many intercessors watching politics today who care passionately about the state of our nation, how should they be praying at this time?
I think crying to God for mercy, crying to God for when we go back, you know, so many churches are returning or have returned this weekend, that the church really needs to get it. They really need to see where we are in God's prophetic time clock, and that we've received and are experiencing God's judgment, and we need to cry out to mercy and for a turning that we might really move on and progress in what God would have us be in this generation.
And I just want to thank you all for watching this home edition of Politics Today. Not only do we need to scrutinise our government, not only do we need to keep them accountable, but we also need to pray for them, because we know that when authoritarian legislation is passed and governments take unprecedented power, then this really does threaten the life of the church in our nation, and our church is to be the light. And the only way that we can preserve our Christian freedoms is if we fight for them and defend them, because we have a great Christian heritage in this country that needs to be defended. So I want to thank you for watching this home edition of Politics Today.